The wind whispered through the narrow alleyways of Kingsbury Run, carrying with it the scent of decay and the distant hum of a city that never truly slept. The dim glow from the few remaining street lamps cast elongated shadows, painting a macabre tapestry on the cracked cobblestones. Dr. Francis Sweeney, his coat collar turned up against the biting chill, moved with a purposeful stride, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically. Every so often he'd pause, his gaze lingering on the huddled figures that lined the streets. The impoverished souls of Kingsbury Run, each with a story of despair, were like moths drawn to the faint glimmers of light, seeking warmth in the cold embrace of the night. A woman, her face etched with the lines of hard living, cradled a crying infant, her eyes vacant, lost in some distant memory or perhaps a dream of a better life. A few steps away, a group of men huddled around a makeshift fire, their laughter hollow, their voices carrying tales of lost jobs and broken promises. Dr. Sweeney's eyes, however, were not those of a mere observer. They were predatory, calculating, scanning each face, each posture, gauging vulnerabilities. There was a hunger in those eyes, a yearning that went beyond mere observation. As he walked, the sounds of Kingsbury Run enveloped him. The distant wail of a harmonica, the soft murmurs of secret conversations, the occasional shout from a drunken brawl. But amidst the cacophony, there was a silence, a void that only Dr. Sweeney could feel, a void he was desperate to fill. Turning a corner, he came upon a small gathering of children, their faces smeared with dirt, playing a game of marbles. They looked up as he approached, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. Dr. Sweeney offered them a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, and continued on his way. The deeper he ventured into Kingsbury Run, the more the weight of the place pressed upon him. It was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of sorrow and lost hopes. And as he walked those dim streets, Dr. Francis Sweeney knew he was both a part of it and apart from it, a shadow among shadows. The rhythmic tapping of his shoes against the cobblestones seemed to echo the relentless beat of artillery fire from a time long past. With each step, Dr. Sweeney was pulled deeper into the recesses of his mind, where memories lay in wait like landmines, ready to explode with the slightest provocation. The trenches. God, those trenches. They stretched on for miles, a serpentine maze of mud and despair. The stench of decay, of bodies and souls rotting away, was a constant companion. The cries of the wounded, the dying, were the lullabies that sang him to restless sleep each night. In the midst of that hell, Dr. Sweeney had been a beacon of hope for many. A surgeon, his hands had danced over torn flesh and shattered bones, stitching together the remnants of young men who'd been fed to the insatiable maw of war. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the line between healer and reaper had blurred. He remembered one soldier, a boy really, no older than 17. The lad had been brought in with a gaping wound in his abdomen, his intestines spilling out like grotesque ribbons. As Dr. Sweeney had worked to save him, the boy had locked eyes with him, his gaze filled with a mix of terror and trust. But despite Sweeney's best efforts, the boy had slipped away, his life ebbing out on a makeshift operating table in the mud. That look, that pleading, trusting look, had haunted Dr. Sweeney ever since. How many had he saved? And how many had he failed? The weight of those questions, of the lives lost under his watch, pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. But there was another memory, one that sent a shiver down his spine. A memory of a surgery that had not been about saving, but about exploring, about pushing the boundaries of life and death. A surgery performed not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, calculated environment of a hidden medical tent. A surgery that had awakened something dark within him, a thirst that the end of the war had not quenched. The streets of Kingsbury Run seemed to close in on him as these memories swirled, the weight of his past bearing down on him, threatening to consume him. But Dr. Sweeney pushed forward, the war within him raging on, a battle between the man he once was and the monster he feared he'd become. The roaring third was a cacophony of vice and indulgence. Neon lights flickered, casting a lurid glow on the streets, where laughter and music spilled out from the numerous bars and brothels. It was a place where the desperate and the depraved came to forget, if only for a few hours. Dr. Sweeney, his silhouette merging with the shadows, stepped into one such establishment. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the scent of cheap perfume. A jazz band played in the corner, their notes weaving a hypnotic spell over the patrons. Men in worn-out suits clinked glasses with women whose dresses clung to them like second skins. But Dr. Sweeney wasn't there for the music or the company. He was on the hunt. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the crowd, assessing, evaluating. Each face told a story, each posture revealed a secret. And Dr. Sweeney, with his surgeon's precision, could read them all. A man, slouched at the bar, his eyes bloodshot, drowning his sorrows. A woman, her laughter a little too loud, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, seeking validation in the arms of strangers. They were all potential victims, each with their own vulnerabilities, their own weaknesses. But it wasn't just about the hunt. It was about the battle raging within him, the dark urges that whispered in his ear, urging him to act, to give in to his basest desires. With each visit to the roaring third, the line between Dr. Sweeney and the monster within grew thinner, more fragile. He'd order a drink, whiskey, neat. The burn as it went down was a temporary distraction, a momentary reprieve from the voices in his head. But as the night wore on and the alcohol flowed, the voices grew louder, more insistent. In the dim corners of the bar, in the secluded rooms of the brothels, Dr. Sweeney would come face to face with his dark urges. The thrill of the chase, the intoxicating power of control, it was a drug, and he was an addict. But each night, he'd leave the roaring third, his thirst unquenched, the monster within still caged, for now. Amidst the haze of smoke and the low hum of conversations, a figure stood out. Florence Polillo, with raven black hair cascading down her back, moved with a grace that seemed out of place in the rough surroundings of the roaring third. Her eyes, a deep shade of hazel, held a mystery, a depth that drew people in, making them want to dive deep and uncover the secrets they held. She wasn't like the other women in the bar. There was an elegance about her, a refinement that hinted at a life once lived in better circumstances. Yet there was also a weariness, a hint of sadness that clung to her like a shadow. Dr. Sweeney, from his vantage point, couldn't help but be captivated. There was something about Florence that resonated with him, a kindred spirit, perhaps. The world saw her beauty, but he saw the scars, the pain that lay just beneath the surface. As the night wore on, their paths seemed destined to cross. A spilled drink, a casual bump, and suddenly they were face to face. The world around them faded as their eyes locked. Words were unnecessary. Their souls seemed to communicate on a level beyond mere speech. Florence's voice, when she finally spoke, was soft, melodic. "I haven't seen you here before," she remarked, a playful hint in her eyes. Dr. Sweeney, usually so composed, found himself momentarily lost for words. "I'm new to the area," he managed to reply, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. They talked, their conversation flowing effortlessly. With each passing minute, the connection between them grew stronger. But behind Dr. Sweeney's polite demeanor, the monster within stirred, sensing an opportunity, a potential victim. Yet for now, the allure of Florence Polillo, with her mysterious aura and captivating presence, kept the beast at bay. The night was young, and their story was just beginning. The bar's atmosphere was thick, almost palpable, as the sultry notes of a saxophone wove through the air, intertwining with the soft murmurs of hushed conversations. The dim lighting, punctuated by the occasional flicker of a candle or the ember of a cigarette, painted a scene of muted colors and shifting shadows. In the corner, a jazz trio played. The saxophonist, a gaunt man with deep-set eyes, poured his soul into every note, making the instrument weep and wail in a mournful lament. The double bass player plucked at his strings, each note resonating deep, echoing the heartbeat of every soul in the room. And the drummer, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, set a rhythm that was both hypnotic and unsettling. Patrons sat huddled at tables, their faces half hidden in the gloom, sharing secrets and stolen glances. The clink of glasses, the soft laughter, the whispered promises, all melded into a symphony of human connection and longing. But amidst this tapestry of sound and emotion, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that, in places like this, danger often lurked just beneath the surface. Every smile might hide a secret. Every glance might be a prelude to betrayal. Dr. Sweeney, seated at the bar, felt the weight of the room's atmosphere pressing down on him. The music, while beautiful, seemed to carry with it a foreboding, a hint of the darkness that lay ahead. The whispers, the hushed tones, they spoke of things unsaid, of stories yet to unfold. He took a sip of his drink, the burn of the whiskey a brief distraction from the unease that gnawed at him. The saxophone's mournful cry seemed to echo his own inner turmoil, a soul in conflict, teetering on the edge of an abyss. As the night deepened, the music played on, each note a reminder that in the dance of life and death, one misstep could lead to a fall from which there was no return. The dim lighting of the bar seemed to grow even fainter as Florence took Dr. Sweeney's hand, leading him to the dance floor. The soft glow from the overhead chandeliers cast a golden hue on her raven-black hair, making her appear almost ethereal. As the two began to move to the melancholic rhythm of the jazz trio, the world around them seemed to blur and fade away. In the intimate closeness of their dance, Dr. Sweeney could feel the warmth of Florence's body, the gentle rise and fall of her chest against his. But beneath the surface calm, a storm raged within him. "She's so fragile, so delicate," his mind whispered, the voice dripping with a dark hunger. "It would be so easy." But then another voice, one rooted in years of medical training and the sacred oath he'd taken, countered, "Do no harm. Remember your purpose, your duty." The two voices battled within him, each trying to drown out the other. The dance became a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil, a dance of desire and restraint. With each step, each turn, memories of his time in the trenches flooded back. The faces of young men, their eyes filled with trust and hope, looking up at him as he wielded his scalpel. The weight of responsibility, the power to give life or take it away had been intoxicating. And now, with Florence in his arms, that same power surged through him, threatening to consume him. "She trusts you," the voice of reason whispered. "Don't betray that trust." But the darker voice, the one that had grown louder and more insistent since his time in the war, taunted him. "You know what you want. Take it. Claim it." As the song reached its crescendo, Dr. Sweeney's grip on Florence tightened, his fingers digging into her flesh. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his for some sign of the man she'd met earlier in the evening. But all she saw was a storm, a tempest of emotion that threatened to engulf them both. The final note of the song hung in the air, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. The last notes of the song seemed to linger, echoing in the silence that followed. The bar's atmosphere, once filled with the hum of conversations and the sultry tones of jazz, now felt heavy, charged with an electric tension. Florence, her cheeks flushed from the dance and the drinks she'd consumed, looked up at Dr. Sweeney, her gaze slightly unfocused but filled with a playful curiosity. "You're quite the dancer, Doctor," she murmured, her voice husky. Dr. Sweeney, his own heart racing from more than just the dance, leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "There's a quiet spot I know, just around the corner. Care to join me?" There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of doubt in Florence's eyes, but the combination of the alcohol and the allure of the mysterious doctor proved too potent to resist. With a coy smile, she nodded. "Lead the way." As they made their way out of the bar, the noise and the lights of the roaring third seemed to recede, replaced by the muted sounds of the city at night. The streets were nearly deserted, the only witnesses to their journey being the moon and the stars overhead. Dr. Sweeney, ever the gentleman, offered Florence his arm, which she accepted with a grateful smile. But beneath the veneer of civility, the air was thick with anticipation. Each step they took seemed to draw them deeper into a web of intrigue and danger. Florence, her senses dulled by the intoxication, was blissfully unaware of the undercurrents swirling around her. She was charmed by the doctor's attentiveness, his cultured demeanor, and the promise of an adventure. But for Dr. Sweeney, the walk was a tightrope act, a delicate balance between his genuine attraction to Florence and the darker urges that threatened to break free. With each step, he battled the voices in his head, the whispers of temptation that urged him to act on his basest desires. As they turned a corner, the city's sounds faded even further, replaced by the distant murmur of the river and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. They were on the edge of the city, where the urban landscape gave way to nature's embrace. Florence, looking around with a mix of wonder and apprehension, turned to Dr. Sweeney. "It's so quiet here," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's the perfect place to get away from it all, don't you think?" And as they continued on their journey to the secluded spot, the line between danger and desire became increasingly blurred, leading them both toward an uncertain fate. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that seemed out of place amidst the urban decay of Kingsbury Run. The walls, once white, were now stained with age and neglect, the paint peeling in places to reveal the rotting wood beneath. But it was the room's contents that truly sent a shiver down one's spine. A single bulb, hanging from a frayed wire in the center of the room, cast a sickly yellow glow, creating a landscape of shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. Beneath this eerie illumination, a table stood, its surface gleaming with a cold metallic sheen. Upon it lay an array of surgical tools, each meticulously arranged, each reflecting the light in a way that seemed almost hungry. Scalpels with razor-sharp edges, bone saws that looked as though they'd seen recent use, and a variety of other instruments, their purpose known only to those with a deep understanding of the human anatomy. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a surgeon's workspace, but the room's aura, the oppressive weight of the air, hinted at something far more sinister. Along one wall, a series of shelves held glass jars filled with a clear liquid. Floating within some of these jars were specimens, organs, tissues, things that should never be displayed as trophies. Each jar was meticulously labeled, the handwriting precise, almost clinical. Florence, her earlier intoxication now replaced by a growing sense of dread, took a hesitant step into the room. The coldness of the floor seeped through her shoes, sending a chill up her spine. She could feel Dr. Sweeney's presence behind her, the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his focus. She turned to face him, searching his eyes for some hint of humanity, some sign that this was all just a twisted joke. But all she saw was a darkness, a void that seemed to go on forever. Dr. Sweeney, his voice barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. "Welcome to my sanctuary." The room, with its chilling contents and the secrets it held, seemed to close in on Florence, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The room's oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on Dr. Sweeney, triggering a cascade of memories that threatened to drown him. The gleaming surgical tools, the cold metallic table, the jars with their grotesque contents. They all served as a bridge to a time and place he had tried so desperately to forget. The trenches of World War I were a hellish landscape, a place where the line between life and death was razor thin. The constant barrage of artillery, the screams of the wounded, the stench of decay. It was a world of chaos and suffering. But amidst this maelstrom, Dr. Sweeney had found his purpose. Flashbacks flooded his mind, each more vivid than the last. a makeshift operating tent lit only by a few lanterns where the wounded were brought in a never-ending stream. Young men, some barely out of their teens, with injuries that defied comprehension. Shattered bones, torn flesh, gaping wounds, the horrors of war laid bare. Dr. Sweeney, his hands steady despite the chaos around him, had worked tirelessly to save as many as he could. The scalpel became an extension of himself, each cut, each stitch, a battle against the grim reaper. But for every life he saved, there were those he couldn't. The weight of those losses, the faces of the young men whose lives had slipped through his fingers, haunted him. Yet, amidst the blood and the pain, there had been moments of clarity, moments when the thrill of the surgery, the power to decide who lived and who died, had awakened something within him. A darkness, a hunger that went beyond the simple act of healing. Back in that dimly lit room in Kingsbury Run, the parallels between his wartime experiences and his current surroundings were unmistakable. The tools, the table, the jars, they were all reminders of a past he couldn't escape. A past that had shaped him, molded him into the man he was today. The memories, with their mix of pain and pleasure, swirled around Dr. Sweeney, threatening to consume him. But as they began to fade, replaced by the cold reality of the present, one thing became clear. The war had never truly ended for him. It had simply changed battlefields. Florence's initial bewilderment at the room's grotesque display slowly morphed into a dawning horror. The meticulous arrangement of the surgical tools, the jars with their macabre contents, the cold, clinical atmosphere, it all pointed to a truth she was reluctant to accept. She took a hesitant step back, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit, a way out of this nightmare. But Dr. Sweeney, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, blocked her path. "Doctor," she began, her voice trembling, "what is this place?" Dr. Sweeney's gaze remained fixed on her, his eyes cold, devoid of emotion. "A place of healing," he replied, his voice eerily calm. "A place where I can practice my art." Florence's heart raced, her mind working overtime as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The charming, cultured man she'd met at the bar, the one who'd seemed so different from the others, was now a stranger, an enigma. The weight of her situation pressed down on her, the walls of the room seeming to close in. Why did you bring me here?" she stammered, tears forming in her eyes. Dr. Sweeney took a step closer, his voice soft, almost soothing. "You're special, Florence. I saw it the moment I laid eyes on you. You have a beauty, a purity that's rare, and I want to preserve it." The implications of his words sent a chill down Florence's spine. She realized, with growing horror, that she was not a guest in this room, but a specimen, a potential addition to Dr. Sweeney's twisted collection. She took another step back, her breathing becoming more erratic. "Please," she whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I promise." Dr. Sweeney's expression remained unchanged, his calmness in stark contrast to Florence's mounting panic. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he replied, his voice dripping with regret. "You've seen too much." As the reality of her situation sank in, Florence's fear gave way to a primal instinct for survival. She knew she had to find a way out, to escape the clutches of the man before her. But with every passing second, the odds seemed to stack against her. The dim room seemed to pulse with tension, the only sound being the ragged breaths of both Florence and Dr. Sweeney. The single bulb overhead cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. Florence, her back pressed against the cold wall, tried to summon any ounce of courage she had left. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, her voice quivering. "There's still time to let me go, to make things right." Dr. Sweeney, his silhouette looming large in the dim light, tilted his head, considering her words. "Make things right," he mused, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. "My dear, everything I do is to make things right, to bring order to the chaos, to preserve beauty in its purest form. Florence's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, a weapon, anything. "But why me?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just an ordinary woman. I have a family, people who love me." Dr. Sweeney took a deliberate step closer, the shadows playing across his face, making his features appear even more sinister. "That's precisely why, Florence. You represent the everyday, the mundane, and in my hands, you can become something extraordinary." The room seemed to close in on Florence, the weight of her impending doom pressing down on her. But deep down, a spark of defiance ignited. "You're sick!" she spat, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "You can try to justify your actions with your twisted logic, but it won't change the fact that you're a monster." Dr. Sweeney's face contorted into a grimace, a hint of anger flashing in his eyes. "Monster? No, Florence, I'm an artist, and you're my canvas." The two continued their dance of shadows, a deadly game of cat and mouse. With each step, each word, the tension grew, building to a climax that seemed inevitable. Florence, summoning every ounce of strength she had left, lunged at Dr. Sweeney, her fingers clawing at his face. The element of surprise was on her side, and for a brief moment, it seemed she might have the upper hand. But Dr. Sweeney, with a strength that belied his age, managed to overpower her, pinning her to the ground. The two locked eyes, the battle of wills reaching its peak. And in that moment, in that final desperate struggle, the line between predator and prey blurred, leading to a climax that would haunt Kingsbury Run for years to come. The room, once filled with tension and desperation, now bore an eerie silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the overhead light and the rhythmic, methodical movements of Dr. Sweeney. Florence's lifeless form lay on the cold, metallic table, her once vibrant eyes now vacant. Dr. Sweeney, with a precision that came from years of medical training, began his grim task. Each incision, each cut, was made with a meticulous care, a reverence for the art he was creating. As he worked, his mind wandered, not to the act itself, but to the thrill it provided. The power, the control, the ability to shape and mold life and death. It was intoxicating. Each movement of his scalpel was a brushstroke, each piece he removed a testament to his skill. The room, with its dim lighting and the shadows cast by the jars on the shelves, took on an almost dreamlike quality. Time seemed to slow, the boundaries between reality and fantasy blurring. Dr. Sweeney paused, admiring his handiwork. The dismemberment, while gruesome to some, was an art form to him, a way to capture the essence of life, to preserve it in its most basic form. He took a deep breath, savoring the metallic scent that filled the air. It was a reminder of the power he wielded, the ability to take life and reshape it to his will. But as he continued his work, a nagging thought crept into his mind. A realization that, while he could control life and death, he couldn't escape the inevitable. The knowledge that one day, he too would be on the other side of the scalpel. With one final cut, Dr. Sweeney stepped back, admiring his creation. Florence, once a vibrant, living being, was now a work of art, a testament to the skill and precision of the artist. And as he cleaned his tools, preparing for the next step in his process, he couldn't help but reflect on the thrill of the kill, the rush that came from holding the power of life and death in his hands. The room, now silent save for the occasional drip of blood from the table, seemed to close in on Dr. Sweeney. The weight of his actions, the gravity of what he had just done, pressed down on him, forcing him into a chair. He sat there, his hands stained with the evidence of his dark deeds, lost in thought. The dim light of the room cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, and in those shadows, memories began to play out. Memories of a time before the darkness had consumed him, before the war had changed everything. He saw himself as a young man, filled with hope and ambition, setting out to change the world through medicine. The joy of his first successful surgery, the pride he felt in his skills, the belief that he was making a difference. But then, the war came, and with it, a descent into a hell he could never have imagined. The trenches, the mud, the constant barrage of artillery. It was a world of chaos and death. But amidst that chaos, Dr. Sweeney had found a purpose. The makeshift operating tents, the wounded soldiers, the desperate attempts to save lives. It was there that he had first felt the thrill of holding life and death in his hands. But the war also brought with it horrors that no man should ever have to witness. The faces of the young men he couldn't save, the screams that haunted his dreams, the weight of the lives lost. It was a burden that had slowly chipped away at his sanity, leading him down a path of darkness. Back in the dimly lit room, Dr. Sweeney's gaze fell on Florence's lifeless form. A wave of regret washed over him, a realization that he had become the very thing he had once sworn to fight against. The line between healer and killer had blurred, and he was lost in the gray area in between. He thought of the other victims, the ones that had come before Florence, and the ones that would inevitably come after. Each one a testament to his twisted desires, his need to feel that rush, that power. But as he sat there, lost in his reflections, a single thought began to take shape. A thought that perhaps there was still a chance for redemption, a way to atone for his sins. With a heavy sigh, Dr. Sweeney rose from his chair, determined to find a way out of the darkness that had consumed him. The night was thick with mist, the air heavy with a dampness that clung to everything. Kingsbury Run, with its labyrinthine alleys and dilapidated buildings, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, whispering secrets of the darkness that lay within. Dr. Sweeney, carrying a bundle wrapped in burlap, moved with a purpose through the winding streets. The weight of his actions, the burden of his guilt, pressed down on him, but there was one final task to complete. He arrived at a particularly desolate spot, a place where the city's decay seemed most pronounced. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast a pale light over the scene, revealing the remnants of a once thriving community now lost to time. With meticulous care, Dr. Sweeney began to arrange Florence's remains. Each piece was placed with precision, creating a tableau that was both haunting and strangely beautiful. It was his signature, a macabre work of art that told a story of obsession, madness, and death. As he stepped back to admire his handiwork, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill down his spine. The scene before him, illuminated by the ghostly moonlight, was a chilling reminder of the depths to which he had sunk. But it was more than just a display. It was a message to the world, to the police, to anyone who dared to enter his domain. It was a declaration of his power, his control over life and death. The twisted arrangement of Florence's remains, juxtaposed against the backdrop of urban decay, was a sight that would haunt the dreams of those who stumbled upon it. A sight that would become the stuff of legends, whispered about in hushed tones and spoken of with a mix of fear and fascination. And as the first rays of dawn began to break, casting a soft light over Kingsbury Run, Dr. Sweeney's macabre signature stood as a testament to the darkness that lay within the human soul. The first light of dawn began to pierce the thick fog of Kingsbury Run, revealing the twisted alleys and forgotten corners of the city. Birds began their morning chorus, their songs a stark contrast to the silence of the night before. Dr. Sweeney, his face pale and eyes haunted, stood at the edge of the run, looking out over the city that had been both his hunting ground and his sanctuary. The weight of his actions, the lives he had taken, pressed down on him, a burden he could no longer bear. With a heavy sigh, he began to move, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness of the morning. The shadows, those ever-present companions of the night, seemed to reach out to him, beckoning him closer. As he walked, the city around him began to change. The familiar landmarks of Kingsbury Run faded, replaced by a landscape that seemed both alien and eerily familiar. The streets, once filled with the sounds of life, were now silent, the buildings empty and abandoned. Dr. Sweeney felt a sense of dislocation, as if he were walking through a dream. The world around him seemed to shift and warp, the boundaries between reality and fantasy blurring. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the world snapped back into focus. Dr. Sweeney found himself standing at the edge of a precipice, the city of Kingsbury Run spread out before him. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. And then, with a sense of finality, he stepped off the edge, disappearing into the shadows below. The city, once again bathed in the golden light of dawn, continued on, oblivious to the darkness that had once walked its streets. But for those who knew, those who had seen the horrors of the night, the shadows of Kingsbury Run would forever hold a sense of unease, a reminder of the evil that can lurk in the hearts of men. As our story comes to a close, let the lull of this soothing ambiance continue to cradle you further into your journey of calmness and rest. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your relaxation and sleep routine tonight. Remember, each day brings a new story, and each night brings a fresh chance to regenerate, to dream, and to become more of who you are. Good night, dear listener. Until our next story, sleep well and dream beautifully.